Hi there, my name is Maggie Allen. I'm at the Graham Sustainability Institute and we're about to start today's webinar. Really quick, just a few housekeeping items. I want to make sure that all of you folks can hear us. So if you can click on your hand in the console panel so that I can see that you can hear me. Great, I'm seeing some raised hands, okay. So we're glad the audio is working. I'm going to turn stuff over to John Cowart, the Director of the Emerging Opportunities Program at the Graham Institute in a second, but real quick, I just want to let you know that you can submit your questions at any time during today's webinar using the question box. We'll be compiling those and sharing those and discussing them at the end of the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, so it's the same website where you registered for the event. And then just to quickly let you know that we have a poll in the webinar to get a sense of who's joining us, but those responses will not be attributable to individuals, and we hope to hear from you. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to John Cowart to start the webinar.
Thanks, Maggie. Welcome, everyone. So glad that you could join us for this third session in this series we're doing related to our project on Great Lakes water levels. What I'll be doing today is just spending a few minutes at the start here to give an overview of this initiative, this integrated assessment. I'll then be presenting the speaker for today, Frank Marsik from the University of Michigan College of Engineering. And then Frank will take the majority of the time that we have for the hour to share the work from his project team. We'll then open it up for questions and discussion, and as Maggie mentioned, that will be moderated through GoToWebinar. So send in your questions as soon as you have them, and we'll get those ready for Frank. And then we'll turn it over to Frank at the very end, just before 1 o'clock when we wrap up, to see if he has any additional thoughts or comments he wanted to share following the presentation and the Q&A. We've got, looks like we're over 80 people have joined us today. We had over 200 people register for this event from a wide range of states and provinces, mostly Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ontario, but 14 states and provinces in total. Just to give us a sense of who is the broad groups that are joining us right now, we're going to do a real simple poll to just ask folks to let us know which sector you're from, so we kind of have that information. So that should be popping up on your screen now, so select your answer.
Yeah, so it's sort of what describes your primary role or sector with regard to water levels. We recognize that some of you will fit multiple categories. Like almost all of you have logged in and answered, so just a couple more seconds. Great, let's take a look at the results. It looks like nearly half of you are associated with local, state, provincial, or federal governments. About a fifth of you are associated with tribal or First Nations representatives. We have some nonprofit organizations, some business, and some private citizens, so a real mix today.
Great, thanks, Maggie, for providing that overview, and for everybody who responded to the poll. It's just a helpful way to know that people are with us on the other end. It's another way for us to check, and the information is helpful too. Just a little bit of the background information. So this is the third session in our 4-part series. The previous 2 sessions from last month are up on the website there. If you were not able to join us, you can go there and listen to those and get all the information from those. And then we have one more coming up next week, a week from today, regarding work that one of the teams has been doing in Southwest Michigan. So if you haven't registered for that yet, that's also available from the project website. Just before we dive into it, I want to make sure to thank the Office of the Great Lakes from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and our University of Michigan Water Center for helping provide support for these projects and for these webinars. So just a little bit of background information on our water levels integrated assessment. We've been working at this for about 2 years now, and our guiding question is, how can we come up with broad-ranging policies and management actions that can help people, businesses, all different sectors within the region adapt to current and future variability in Great Lakes water levels. And we've been looking at a variety of impact areas: infrastructure, shoreline economies, habitat, water quality, recreation, and tourism. The purpose is to come up with a set of adaptive strategies that will serve and respond to the concerns that have been identified. A primary goal is to make this a very place-based initiative. So the 4 projects have been working very closely with local partners on very local concerns within the broader context of lake level variability. And while we are trying to look throughout the entire region, as you can see from the titles and the project areas, we've mainly been focused in Michigan and Huron, although as we move into the next stage of the project, we're going to try to work to make those applicable throughout the region. And it's great to see that for the registration today, we did have people who expressed their lake of primary interest as one of the 5 Great Lakes. So we've got folks who are interested in what's going on in all 5 of the Great Lakes. So that was great to see that in our registration information. Finally, for me, I just want to make sure folks are kind of familiar with where we've been and where we're going with this project. We started with some planning grants last year. Then from that, the 4 teams which are presenting as a part of this webinar series focused in the first phase, looking at trying to do what's going on, what are the status trends, causes, and consequences related to lake level variability in their 4 locations. We've just completed the second phase, which is working with all of that stakeholder input in each of those locations. The teams have come up with the reports which analyze options or policies to address the concerns that were identified and investigated regarding lake level variability. And then where we're going next is that the teams will work together with us here at the Graham Institute to develop a final comprehensive report of select options. We hope to have that ready next spring. Just before we kind of move into the presentation today, I want to note that we're not going to go into too much background information about lake level variability, the science and the history available regarding that. We have lots of resources on our website for that, both from the very first presentation from this webinar series and from an event we held last May. I guess the general thing is that we're working with an understanding that there's going to be lake level variability will continue, and we're going to see periods of highs and lows, and that's pretty much the focus of all 4 of our teams is what are options to address living with that variability. So with that, I'm going to introduce the presenters for today. Our main presenter will be Frank Marsik. He'll also be joined by Ricky Rude. And the topic is climate change, lake levels, tribal fisheries, and culturally important sites. Both Frank and Ricky are with the Climate and Space Sciences and Engineering Department in the College of Engineering at the University of Michigan. Frank brings expertise in modeling atmospheric transport and meteorological field measurements. And Ricky's work focuses on climate change and society, climate informatics, modeling, and he's quite an active blogger. You might find him on Wonderground, Climate Policy, and The Conversation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank to take us into the presentation for today.
Okay, thank you very much, John and Maggie. And I'd just like to echo John's note of appreciation to our funding partners. Obviously, without their support, none of this would be possible. So what I'd like to do is just kind of give an outline here. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our partners that have been working with us on this project. I know John is advised us not to spend too much time talking about the first part of our project, but I do want to set the stage a little bit regarding some of our plausible lake level futures that we're considering and why we're doing the approach we are. Anytime we start talking about how the tribes might start developing adaptation plans, there needs to be a little discussion about the relationship between the tribes and the federal government in the state of Michigan, and so we'll talk about that briefly. Then we'll move on, talk a little bit about some of the climate adaptation options and policies that we're considering, and I will admit that we're at the very beginning stages of this, so nothing that we will be talking about has been, discussed before tribal council, for instance, and there are no official statements or anything like that, but we're working with the natural resources staff and the fisheries staff with our tribes, and we're just kind of starting to move into that direction. So And then we'll end with some discussion, conclusions, and some questions. Our project partners are the Little Traverse Bay bands of Odawa Indians and Harbor Springs. Our primary folks we've been working with are Jonathan Makmar and Kevin Donner as fisheries biologists, and then Janan Kato is the education director at the LTBB, and then the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians in Peshabastown. Our primary contact there is Carolyn Sonderegger. Most of what we'll be talking about today is associated with our conversations with the Little Traverse Bay Bands. Grand Traverse Band is just getting started in this project, and much of what we're talking about with that group now is really starting to focus on education initiatives, informing the community about some of the issues, and from that point on, moving into the more traditional aspects of having town meetings and things like that to start understanding the concerns of that particular group. I'm very thankful for this list of people, particularly because I'm a mere meteorologist, and I'm doing my best to learn all about the tribal customs, tribal law, and a variety of other things, and they have been very nice in allowing me to ask all kinds of questions. I should note that as we've been doing this work, we're trying to follow the guiding principles of a work that was put together, Climate Traditional Knowledge Work Group, of which Kyle White, one of our co-authors, is our project partners here, is a co-author. And it provides some guidelines for considering traditional ecological knowledge in climate change initiatives. And a couple of the important things are that in these interactions between our group and the tribes, to cause no harm and free and prior and informed consent. And really the crux of this is that we need to be very protective of the traditions and the customs of the tribes. And as we move forward, there are times that we will provide them with information to help them make some of the decisions in terms of how they want to move forward with their climate adaptation processes. We recognize there may be information about, for instance, traditional ceremonial sites that they prefer not to have out in the public domain, and we respect that, and we're working with those within those constraints, if you will. A little bit of history about before we get into the crux of our work. Most folks know, through Fires Confederacy, the Ottawa, the Chippewa, and the Potawatomi moved westward into the Great Lakes region and eventually migrated into the upper and lower peninsulas of what would become the state of Michigan. Much of the interaction between the tribes and the federal government really, came to a head during the 1800s. During the early 1800s, there were a series of Supreme Court decisions called the Marshall Trilogy that really shaped that relationship. One of those, the Johnson versus McIntosh, stated that the Supreme Court decided that although Indians were rightful occupants of the land, tribes had no power to sell the land without the approval of the federal government. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia decided that the Indians were neither citizens of the United States nor foreign nations. Instead, were considered domestic dependent nations whose relationship to the U.S. is stated as resembling the ward to his guardian. And then finally, Worcester versus Georgia, Supreme Court decided that the state of Georgia had no authority over the actions within the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation, and that Congress, not the states, had the overriding power regarding the Indian tribes. Now, I've just summarized three major Supreme Court decisions in a matter of a few seconds, so obviously this is a simplistic way of looking at it, but I think it's important to keep that in the back of our minds as we move forward. There were two major treaties impacting the Great Lakes indigenous nations. In the Treaty of 1836, these nations ceded lands to the United States while retaining hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. And then the Treaty of 1855 U.S. acquired additional lands in what's now the state of Michigan, and it was this point that the indigenous nations were provided with reserved lands. Our project locations, if you will, are right here. You can see that black boundary actually represents the territory that was ceded as part of the 1836 treaty. One of the key things to consider here is that traditionally before the U.S. started to expand into these territories of the Great Lakes, the tribal communities would pretty much, or could adapt to changing conditions or resources by moving freely across the Great Lakes region. Once these treaties were put in place and the locations of the reservation boundaries were fixed within the Treaty of 1855, that became not an option. And so much of what we're talking about now is the fact that the tribes in their present locations need to adapt within the physical constraints of the reservation boundaries. This image here I just want to show from the Little Traverse Bay bands shows basically the tribal reservation land from 1855. The much smaller black areas that you see are trust lands. Those are the lands that are actually owned by the tribe, but the federal government holds the legal title, for which the beneficial interest remains with the tribes. You can see, even though there's a fairly broad area, for instance, of Emmett and Charlevoix counties that are considered reservation lands for the LTBB, the amount of property that they actually own and have control over is significantly smaller than that amount. Now, the topic of our presentation involved the fact that we're trying to use the consideration of changes in our climate in the management of tribal fisheries and protection of cultural sites. I just wanted to put this up quickly. As John said, we're not going to review climate and lake level histories in any great extent here, but this is from GLESA, and basically showing that indeed with both temperature and precipitation, comparing the climatological periods of 51 to 80 and then 1981 to 2010, we're seeing increases across the seasons. It varies somewhat, but for Northwest Lower Michigan, our climate is changing. We won't even discuss at this point the reasons why, right? That's a whole different topic, but the fact is that our climate is changing, and it is changing in a way that the tribes understand that they need to start thinking of what are plans that they can make now, that if these trends do continue, and we believe they will, how they'll be able to protect their resources and their culture. So some particular concerns that the tribes have expressed to us, number one, because of the great importance of the Great Lake fisheries to them, both in terms of economy and culture, the need to be able to protect the quality of Great Lakes fisheries under plausible climate futures, and this involves protection of spawning and nursery areas, in other words, wetland areas along the coast, and also physical infrastructure, being able to ensure access to the fisheries by tribal commercial fishermen and recreational users as well. During the more recent low periods in lake levels in Lake Michigan and Huron during the a few years ago, one of the things that became of concern was the protection of cultural sites, including historical burial grounds, artifacts, and ceremonial grounds that had become exposed once the water levels receded. And so that's another focus area of the work that we're doing. Tribal fisheries are an important part of what we're talking about. As some may know, the discussions between the use of the fisheries in the Great Lakes between the tribes and recreational users resulted in a series of consent decrees being developed currently. We're under the 2000 consent decree that will expire in 2020, and therefore negotiations are already starting to get underway for the next consent decree. What these decrees basically do is they determine by tribe which areas they are allowed to fish in, whether it be commercial, subsistence, or whatever. And within this grid structure that you're seeing, it's dictated what types of fish, what number, and also the methods that can be used. So if we're looking at a changing climate and understanding that there's the possibility that the distribution of the fish species may change as they migrate into more favorable conditions, once this is set, this is the law of the land. This is what the tribes have to adhere to. And so having some feeling for how the fisheries may change over the course of the next 20 to 30 years is important as these negotiations go forward. it is a bit interesting that many of these types of relationships we often think about are changing climate in terms of mid-century and end of the century. And from a legal perspective, that makes a lot of sense, but we also have to keep in mind that when the tribes in general start thinking about the future, they're not thinking about 50 to 100 years. Very common to talk about the next 7 generations. And so we're not, as we're talking with our partners, not just thinking in terms of what happens over the next 20, 30 years, but looking at some of those longer time frames as well. So what is the link? Obviously, there's a lot of things that will impact the fisheries, and probably temperature, water temperatures is going to be one of the great ones. But in terms of lake levels, one of the ways that they'll impact the fisheries or have the potential is in the coastal ecosystems. Actually, lake level variability is a good thing for the health of a coastal ecosystem because it provides a great deal of wetland diversity of the vegetation. And so wetland diversity leads to productive spawning and nursery habitats, and thus a diverse population of fish species. The kind of the cartoon I have is after a publication by Wilcox about a decade or so ago, showing kind of the typical vegetation gradient that we might see. If we see periods where the water levels are low and stay that way, many of the more woodier plants have a chance to move in and take over, and also invasive species like Phragmites. And so any potential for perhaps a low lake level for a sustained time period, tribes are also going to start to need to think about how to handle the invasive species. Right now, most of that problem, at least in terms of the Phragmites, exists more across the southern Great Lakes than in the area of concern for the Little Traverse Bay Band and the Grand Traverse Bands. The pictures below are just simply there to remind us that even though we have these nice textbook pictures of what wetlands look like, in the Great Lakes they don't necessarily look like that. The picture on the lower left is one I took in the Suttons Bay area, so we can see some of those woody plants near the edge, and then some of the emergent vegetation. But many of the important spawning and nurturing habitats in the Great Lakes don't have any vegetation at all. This is an example for whitefish, where sort of the rocky shoal areas are the areas of importance. So if we're talking about the impact of climate on the fisheries, we not only talk about the vegetation, but also some of these non-vegetative wetlands. Lots of uncertainty when we start talking about future lake levels. This is from the GLERL Great Lakes Water Level Dashboard. Off to the right-hand side, you can see some colored bars. Those are the predictions going into the future toward the end of the century from a couple of models. You see some dashed bars there toward the end that are predictions of lake levels from different models. You can see quite a variation, as much as a meter. Much of that variation right now is believed to be driven by how the models describe potential evapotranspiration. There's still discussions as to what are the best approaches to do that. And so our concern was our concern was trying to base what we're doing on the uncertainty of those models. And so we started looking more at the observed data. This is a picture also from one of the GLERL dashboards. We know that influences on lake levels are varied, including precipitation, runoff, and evaporation. That's a really key one. In this image you're looking at now, you can see kind of the blue dots. That's the lake levels for Lake Michigan-Huron system from about February of 2009 to present. Not exact correspondence, but one thing that's pretty clear is during the period of around 2008 or 9 to 2013, when we had our low water levels, we saw a period of relatively little ice cover. When we had a couple of winters where we saw a return of significant ice cover, that greatly reduced the evaporation that frequently happens to a large extent during the winter season, and we saw the lake levels responding. And so one of the things we wanted to look at was perhaps a relationship with ice cover. Here's a work by Jonathan Martin of the University of Wisconsin, and he is looking at, over the past 66 years, how the global polar ice cover has been shrinking. And he was looking at that. He was also looking at what the impact of that is on the cold pool. That's the big air masses of cold air across the poles. The image on the right is just an example in the wintertime of the extent you might see of where the -5 degree centigrade line is. Everything kind of within that reddish area is temperatures colder than that. And when we have wintertime cold outbreaks, that's where that air is coming from. And so the idea of Martin's work was looking at how those areas are changing as the polar ice cover is gradually shrinking with a warming climate. So what I did in the top figure here was we looked at the maximum winter season ice cover on Lake Michigan, comparing that to the size basically of that cold pool. The bottom line here is that as that cold pool is shrinking due to the shrinking ice cover, the result is that we're tending toward a reduced amount of ice cover across the Great Lakes, potentially then resulting in more evaporation and lower lake levels. Our partners at Little Traverse Bay Band have found that there's a close relationship between larval fish survival and ice cover. These images are from some work by some folks at Michigan State, and what you can see kind of on the left-hand side of the diagram is a situation in which there is a significant ice cover, and the point here is when the whitefish go and they spawn in the rocky shoals, that ice cover is there to protect them and give them a better chance for survival through the winter. The lower right figure is one in which the ice cover is reduced, and in essence, in that case, the eggs that are spawned are more prone to rough water motion, and their survival rate goes down. That could indeed, in the coastal areas, impact the success of the fish. So there's an important reason why we're thinking of, or why we're looking at that relationship. For our group, this is kind of the Lake Michigan-Huron water levels from 1918 to present. You can kind of see the historical average from about 1920 to the present, and we're kind of looking at that variability that we've seen by the 10th percentile and 19th percentile there. So obviously significant variability on the order from the top and the bottom to over a meter. As we look into the future, if we think about that relationship of having less ice cover, more evaporation, and potentially lower water levels, then we might be looking at, if we just take and look at the potential future average, which based on our analysis suggests it might be as low as 176 meters, and we consider or think about having the same amount of variability, that means that on the extreme end of things, we could be seeing lake levels that are lower than we've witnessed in some time. And that can be a considerable problem. And the issue is that, or one of the things to consider here, and why our partnership with the tribes is so important, is this is from the measured data, and we're talking about the potential of having conditions exist that we have no measured data for. But the traditional ecological knowledge that the tribes possess goes extensively farther back and has the potential to provide important information about what the vulnerabilities to the tribes might be under such potential extreme conditions. Here's kind of an example. On the upper part of this is from the NOAA lake level viewer, and this is up in the northern part of Lower Michigan, the Wilderness Park. And what you can see is that in the upper we have a picture of what that landforms look like, Wilderness State Park, under current water levels, at least estimated for October of 2016. And the lower one represents what those landforms would look like under our worst case scenario, if you will, from that previous figure, going down to about 175.6 meters. And what you can tell is in the islands that extend off of the Wilderness State Park, or are part of it, where there are distinct islands in the or landforms in the top figure, much of that, as the water levels recede, will almost form a land bridge. And most certainly for important fisheries areas in that region, this would have a significant impact. And so it's an example of potential or plausible future conditions that need to be considered and how the tribe might adapt to those. Just so folks know, I'm a little bit of a cynic sometimes, and so I don't want to just, I'm sure that the folks at NOAA did a wonderful job in developing this tool, but we are looking back and trying to ensure, evaluate how the model is going to, or has been able to replicate conditions of the past before we start looking too far into the future. The area that I've kind of enlarged is kind of at the top figure, that yellow box, and on the lower left-hand side is the lake level viewer's assessment of what water levels would be if, or what the landforms would look like if the water levels were down to about 176 meters. On the right-hand side, we're using some aerial photography from the Michigan State Remote Sensing and GIS group, and kind of the area in the yellow oval is showing that there's a pretty good, I think an excellent correspondence between what the lake level viewer is suggesting that the landform should look like and what the aerial photography suggests they actually looks like. We're continuing to look at this for various high and low water level periods, but thus far the results are fairly promising, giving us and the tribe's confidence that we might be able to use this tool to look into the future at what the coastline will look like under various lake level conditions. So as we start to narrow in on what some of these plausible future conditions might look like, and start trying to come up with some plans, there's sort of a three-pronged approach, if you will, that the tribes will be most likely needing to engage in. And I keep saying most likely needing to engage in because, again, we're kind of at that point in our project where we have not definitively come up with a set of plausible adaptation actions. But this kind of, I think, represents three important areas that we'll be needing to consider as we work with the tribes in this work. First is working with federal, state, and local officials. As adaptation actions are developed or desired, one of the ways that the tribe is going to be able to need to work is in close coordination with the government agencies. As we noticed, even though the tribal reservation is a significant extent, the actual amount of property that the tribe actually owns is small. So there's a definite need to work with folks. So there's options related to permitting, ordinances, and collaborative practices. And before we talk about a few of those options, again, I think we need to step back and look at what the relationship is between the tribes and some of these organizations. So in terms of the permitting across the Great Lakes, which may be an important way in which the tribes can be involved in the process, there's two main groups, one being the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that's representing the federal government, and then the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality Water Division representing the state of Michigan. The principles, like I said, that are for these are founded in the Constitution and a variety of federal laws and executive orders. And these are the principles that the Army Corps of Engineers uses. So the first is that the Corps recognizes the tribal governments as sovereign entities. As the domestic we talked about the domestic partnership. The Army, the U.S. government has some federal trust responsibilities and obligations that the Corps will adhere to. An important principle is that the Corps leaders understand that these are tribal nations, even if they are domestic dependent nations, and so they need to meet as governments and to recognize the tribe's right to self-determination. Additionally, and I apologize for the wordiness of these slides, I kind of highlighted the important things. The Corps understands they'll work with the tribes collaboratively before and throughout the decision-making process. And I think that's one of the most important ones here, simply because rather than the Corps coming up with ideas and then imposing them on the tribes, they're working with them collaboratively throughout the process to make sure that the tribal voice is heard. They'll also be trying to help build economic capacity with the tribes and fulfill their obligations and consider potential effects on the natural and cultural resources, and are complying with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And as we mentioned before, during those low water periods, there was concern about tribal burial grounds being exposed, and so this is a very key part of this. The Intergovernmental Accord was established between the state of Michigan and the tribes. This was established by then Governor Granholm, and the governor and the tribes basically have affirmed a joint commitment to the preservation, restoration, and enhancement of the Great Lakes. So very formal agreements have been put in place between the state and the federally recognized tribes, the 12 of them within the state of Michigan. One point must be made, though. A current challenge faced by the tribes, at least the Little Traverse Bay bands. On August of last year, the Little Traverse Bay bands filed a federal complaint against Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, seeking formal recognition of the treaty reservation boundaries from 1855. And in the press release from this, the tribe notes they're not seeking to obtain titles of private lands or to remove private owners from their properties or impact property values, but establishing those boundaries is very important for how the tribes then can work with both the federal, the state, and local governments and the many local community groups that are there. And so the status of this federal suit is at this point is unknown, and so that's in part why the tribe cannot necessarily in the very near future establish a complete set of options, because one of the driving forces regarding those will be how the courts decide the state and the tribes will consider those tribal reservation boundaries. So let's talk about the possibility of permitting. Well, one of the concerns that the tribes expressed to us was that during low water periods, there were concerns about the viability of the coastal wetland vegetation. So, and that, as we mentioned, has an important link to areas for fisheries during those extended periods of low water levels. For instance, one concern is that during those low water periods, I think a very common thing was for a lakeshore landowner to want to clean up the beach and maybe expand the beach off of their property. A concern with this, though, is that if that is done, once the water levels return, and we know they're variable and we know they will return, but if a significant amount of native vegetation is removed, that won't be there in that same area that maybe 5-10 years earlier was a very productive nursery ground, might no longer be viable because the native vegetation is gone. If someone wants to do that type of an activity, they're required to form a joint or to submit a joint application to the state of Michigan and the U.S. Army Corps. If the proposed work has a major impact on the wetlands, such as removal of native vegetation, then a public notice would likely need to be issued, and then the tribes would have an opportunity to express their concerns about it during that open comment period. Let's talk just briefly about the Army Corps. They have a couple of permits. They have a federal jurisdiction between the edge of the water, that's kind of that red triangle, and then the blue line is called the ordinary high water mark. That is basically kind of a traditional location where the water may rise to. And their authority is based on Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, and then part of the Clean Water Act. They have kind of two broad permit categories. One is a general permit, so if there's minimal impacts on the environment expected. These are kind of renewed every 5 years, and so during those renewal periods, the tribes would have an opportunity to express any concerns that they may have. But once those are established, there's not necessarily a need for a public notice if a proposed project has a minimal impact on the environment. And so sort of the tribe's opportunity to have an input would really be in that every 5-year juncture for those simpler projects. If the activity is not covered by the general permit, and so in other words, if someone wanted to do a larger scale removal of the vegetation, which certainly from a wetland fisheries perspective would be of concern, then an individual permit would need to be issued. These do require public notices, and as a result, again, tribes and other local citizens would have an opportunity at that point to have a comment. So certainly if this is a concern of the tribes, which it is, this is one mechanism in which the tribes can keep abreast of when these public notices are being issued and have that opportunity to step in and express their concerns to protect those wetlands offshore of their reservation boundaries. The state of Michigan also has a series of permit categories. Their area of jurisdiction for the DEQ is very similar. They have also a couple of categories, general and minor, which are for activities that are expected to have a minimal adverse effect, and then an individual permit if activities are expected to have more than just that minimal adverse effect. This category requires a period of formal notice and also the opportunity to comment. It should be noted that if someone does put forth an application, they need approval from both the state and the Army Corps in order to move forward. So another example of the type of thing that the tribes might be able to do, if the fish in spawning areas along the coastal rocky shores might be impacted, how might that occur? Well, if the water levels are varying, an area that might have had a sufficient depth to protect the eggs after they're spawned might no longer exist. And so a particular area that was a successful spawning area might not be that way anymore. And so one of the concerns then would be, how could the tribes support the fish community during this period of transition, when perhaps the viable spawning grounds that were in one location shift downshore to another location, that the bathymetry might be better. So potential actions, the Little Traverse Bay Bands recently built a beautiful new facility for a fish hatchery that they've been successfully using to help support the Cisco population in that area. They could use the fish hatchery to grow some fish and aid, work with the state of Michigan, for instance, in stocking of the coastal areas. Any type of that activity, though, would require coordination through what is referred to as the Technical Fisheries Committee, that is comprised of state, tribal, and federal biologists. I've been talking to Kevin Donner, who's the fisheries biologist. He said that it's a pretty complex thing, and this wouldn't be the first thing that they would think of. First of all, they need to establish for sure that there are relationships between these shifts in the water levels and the shifts in these spawning areas. And while this could be a tool, the issue is you don't simply take one type of fish like whitefish or lake trout and raise them and restock. That there's an entire ecosystem, a community that needs to be addressed as well. And so even though this right now is maybe a minor option, the reason why I brought it up is I think it underscores that as the tribe is moving forward, they have some additional considerations when they're developing some of their ideas in terms of what adaptive actions might be. For instance, if a fish population is declining, and we know there are a number of reasons why that could be, but a particular option may be taking fish from another area where the populations are very robust and moving it to a part of the lake where those populations are under stress. In talking with Kevin, he said that that's not the type of thing that the tribe would be necessarily supportive of, because number one, you're moving fish from an area where they've genetically developed to another completely different environment, and also from the relationships that the tribes have with the environment, it simply would not be an acceptable practice or a desirable practice to take the fish from a native area and move them to a completely area that's away from their native homes. There are other groups to work with. The options for the tribes is we're looking at plausible adaptive actions. One is working with regional organizations like the Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council or the Lake Traverse Conservancy or other community and lakeshore organizations, because of the actions that the tribes may want to take, they may not all be associated with a permit. For instance, if there are concerns about the exposure of burial grounds or artifacts when lower lake water levels develop, there's not necessarily a permit or a legal action that you can have to stop a general member of the public or a member of the tribes themselves from wandering out and exploring these areas, these sacred areas that need to be kept pristine. And so one of the things that can happen is that they can work with these regional organizations to help get the word out that there's a particular area of concern, and they can seek and work with these different groups to come up with strategies for how they might address this situation. Just to kind of give you an example of one that has happened is a concept of cultural and conservation easements. An easement is my wife's a civil engineer, so she talks about these a lot. I'm slowly learning about them. But easements is the grant of a non-possessory property interest that grants an easement holder permission to use another person's land. In other words, someone owns a set of property and another person would like to be able to use that land for a particular purpose. These easements can be formal agreements that allow that to happen. One example in which the tribe worked with some of these regional groups to make something like that happen was a number of years ago. The Little Traverse Conservancy has a nature preserve, the Susan's Creek Nature Preserve, and within that was some other land. And the Susan's Creek, or that preserve, they wanted to be able to incorporate some of that as part of the preserve as well. But the tribe and the Conservancy worked together. The Conservancy worked to purchase that, and then the Little Traverse Band was able to purchase that land back to them. However, they developed one of these conservation easements that basically the land was purchased by the tribe, held in trust by the U.S. government, and then an easement was developed so that the Little Traverse Conservancy then could allow the general public that's using, for instance, the Susan's Lake Preserve to then also use the Tammy Lynn Hogue natural area that was developed by the Little Traverse Bay. And so right now there's an interpretive trail that runs through that area, and because of this kind of a cooperative agreement, the entire trail system is open to the public. And so one option would be, if there are particular areas along the coastlines that are of cultural importance to the tribe, they could work out similar agreements with those property owners, and thus having a way in that sense of protecting those regions, because usually when they have these easements that are developed, there can be stipulations put in there that restrict what types of changes could be made to those locations. And lastly, kind of an important link that can happen is simply education. And I sort of mentioned that as an adaptation option or policy when talking about working with the regional organizations and then determining how they can inform the public and the constituents of their groups about some of the concerns that the tribe may have. But there are other ways that the tribe in itself can get involved in some of these educational opportunities, both within the tribal community and the non-tribal community. We're working with the tribe now to start considering how we might use a tool called the Esri Story Maps. And these basically are a way of incorporating GIS information along with supportive information. So an example, and I just kind of created this one. This doesn't exist other than a little template on my computer. But we could be looking at something related to tribal fisheries and climate adaptation. And you could have a tab here, one for each of the tribes, one for the Little Traverse Bay Band and one for the Grand Traverse Band, that maybe speak to certain concerns that those tribes have. And they could include maps and other general information that then could be available not only to tribal members, but other members in the public citizens in the Great Lakes region that would allow the tribes a method of conveying these important pieces of information about where perhaps some sacred areas are and what considerations the tribes would like of the general community. Additionally, there are some other things that are happening. One of our co-authors in this, Kyle White, is from Michigan State, and he is citizen Potawatomi. And Kyle, one of the things that Kyle is very interested in doing is seeing how groups might be able to, how tribes and nations might be able to consider both Western science approaches to solving problems like climate change adaptation, and how they might use both climate change or Western knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. And sort of to build that capacity within the tribes themselves, we've been working with the tribe, and they have a regular summer camp that they develop. And so as one of the activities over recent years has been to include an investigation of the impact of climate change on their environment as part of this summer youth camp by considering both traditional ecological knowledge and Western science viewpoints. And so we're working with the tribes, not only from that education perspective, but also, as we mentioned, trying to bring those two together in our work in general. And, considering potential some future actives, I was talking with Jan Cotto, and she was mentioning that the tribal women are considered the caretakers of the water and are involved in educational and ceremonial roles about water and potential stresses on the water. And so one of the things that we're talking about and that will need to be considered by the tribes involves if we are expecting certain stresses on the lakeshore environment due to changes in lake water or simply the lake water variability, that is going to perhaps impact elements of the cultural role of the women within the tribes themselves. And so we're already starting to think forward about what types of educational initiatives might be needed tied to those roles. So lastly, kind of in conclusion, our current project is really starting to develop some plausible adaptation strategies for consideration. There's nothing formally put together at this juncture. The LTBB is already developing a broader climate change adaptation plan. Our lake levels plan is actually just a small element of that. There are already existing mechanisms in place that we've sort of talked about with participation in permitting reviews, regional dialogue, and the like. And then again, looking ahead with some of this work, one of the really kind of important issues is going to be, for instance, the recognition of those reservation boundaries and how that plays into tribal self-governance. And then as we move forward, also definitely interested in reaching out to some of the other tribal nations in the Great Lakes region to find out how they're working. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. There's lots of groups in the Great Lakes that are looking at these types of issues, and so we're trying to learn from these different groups that have already been spending a fair amount of time on these issues, and we look forward to continuing moving in those directions. So with that, I say thank you, and I'm willing to take any questions in the time we have left.
Great. Thanks so much, Frank. We have a couple of minutes left for questions here, and just kind of getting things reset here. Great. Maggie, you want to?
Yeah, so first just a quick comment with regard to some of the options. Someone joining us who is a communications expert was noting that the Esri story maps can be a great tool to reach a public audience, so some great feedback from the audience on that. I also have a question that goes back to the beginning of the presentation. The audience member is wondering how to factor in increased precipitation in the Great Lakes Basin caused by climate change with the long-range prediction of lake levels going down due to increased evaporation. I don't know, Ricky, maybe you want to respond to that?
Well, I'm not sure I'm any better than Mike responding to it, but, it's than Frank.
To either of you.
Yeah.
It's basically that the balance, the conservation of water is more than just precipitation and evaporation. One of the, there's runoff and there's groundwater, but I think one of the things that that Frank indicated here was the role of lake ice and freezing, which has a really quite large effect on what happens in the season following it and warmth. That's a non-linear effect that accumulates over the course of the year. So I think what you're seeing in those projections is something like, the change in lake ice climatologies.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is, we had some, is natural of any project, you have kind of in your mind formulated how you're going to move forward, and certainly we were hoping to be able to use some of the model information to suggest what some of the plausible futures were, and you start getting involved in that, and then you realize what the uncertainties are. And so, in looking at that relationship between the lake ice and like, for instance, the cold pool that we were talking about, I kind of moved past it, but that relationship between the size of that cold Arctic air sitting up there and what that particular winter's ice coverage was only explained about 25%, 24 or 25% of the variability. So there's a lot of other things going on. And so while we had initially wanted to get very specific about what these plausible lake level futures were based on a changing climate, quickly came to the realization that we can't simply look at these and suggest, well, in general, we may be looking at, lower levels. We really, in working with the tribes, need to consider that full range. And so in that sense, there were some changes, shifts, if you will, in some of our focus as we move through the project.
Great. I have another question, wondering sort of some clarification whether the LTBB has a draft adaptation plan, and sort of if so, talking about information sharing, is it possible to see those kinds of plans, or is that information shared?
So at this point, Jonathan Mockmer is the gentleman who's kind of leading that effort. I guess one of the considerations is it's possible as moving forward when the tribe feels that plan has some substance into it and some finality to it. I mean, I can't speak for John or the tribe, obviously, but I suspect as we're moving forward, that some of these things can be shared. But again, we always have to remember that these are tribal nations, and they have the right to say what it is and that they feel they need to protect, and what they feel comfortable sharing. And in our relationship, as we're working on this project, we're constantly discussing that there are going to be some things that, as for instance, that link between looking at our Western our data that we have and traditional information they have from oral histories and things like that. Yes, in the best of worlds, getting that information would help me to understand things, but I also have to respect their self-determination, and that understanding that maybe a lot of that information may be provided to them and allow them to develop the plans without maybe sharing some of that real specific information with us. So I think probably some of that sharing, again, I can't speak for them, I think that some of that sharing is important and probably will happen, but in doing so, we have to remember that there's probably some limit to the extent that some of that information can be saved or shared, rather.
Thanks, Frank. We're almost at 1 o'clock. I just wanted to see if you had any additional comments you wanted to share with the folks that have joined us.
Thanking everyone for participating. I've talked enough, so they don't want to hear me talk anymore. But I would just say that my email address, I don't know if that's posted anywhere. It wasn't on my presentation, but so my email address is just my last name, also at umich.edu. They can direct questions to the Graham email address that's there, or if anyone wants to email me directly. As I said, I'm a mere meteorologist trying to learn a lot of complex things, and I appreciate any support that anyone might want to provide.
Great. So thanks so much for the presentation today, Frank, and Ricky, for your comments too. Also want to extend a broader thanks to all the partners and folks that have worked with you on your project, to Maggie and Lello, who kind of help make things work smoothly. And just finally, just want to invite folks to join us for the final session in the webinar series next Thursday, December 8th, which will be Developing Land Use Regulation and Infrastructure Policy in Southwest Michigan. For those of you who did join us today, we'll be sending out an announcement soon once everything has been posted to the website, in case you wanted to go back and review anything or share it with others. So with that, anything else, Maggie?
No, just if we didn't get to your question, check back to the website. Once the series is over, we're going to be posting a Q&A document for questions that we weren't able to get to during the live webinars.
Great. So we're at 1 o'clock. Thanks again, everyone, for your time and input, and enjoy the rest of your day.